Ah, got it.
Oh,
Okay.
we said something about YouTube.
Yep, exactly. Susumu. Yep.
This takes a few seconds.
Okay.
And
Alrighty.
all right, I think we are live on YouTube. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 21st International Primatology Lecture on Past, Present, and Future Perspectives of the Field. I'm Susumu Tamiya of Kyoto University's International Center for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology, also known as CICASP. For this seminar series, we invite distinguished primatologists and wildlife scientists from across the globe to learn about how groundbreaking discoveries are made and important new programs are developed and implemented. We also want to think about where the fields of primatology and wildlife science should be headed next. Along the way, we also want to get some career advice from these distinguished guest speakers. Today's lecture will be archived on our YouTube channel, and actually you can watch most of our previous lectures there as well. There will be time for Q&A after today's lecture. So whether you are listening to this on YouTube or on Zoom, feel free to start adding your comments and questions on the chat board at any point during the lecture. All right, so I would like to ask the founder of this seminar series, Dr. Mike Huffman, to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Fred Bercovitch. Mike.
Thanks a lot. Fred, welcome. Welcome back. Fred has been a member of CICAS for several years when he was living here in Japan. Fred and I go back a long ways. He's actually one of the first field primatologists I met outside of Japan when I first got into the monkey business. I visited his field site in Kenya at Gilgil back in 1980 on my way back from Japan to finish up my undergraduate work. And so this friendship with Fred has been a long one. And we've shared a lot of interesting experiences and things together and a lot of common friends. And I'm really looking forward to his talk today because it's going to summarize the essence of the Bercovitch way of doing science, which is really incredible, very diverse. And I think you'll all really enjoy it. So without further ado, Fred, I'm handing it over to you.
All right, thanks, Mike. So how do I get the first picture? Oh, there. Oh, okay. So, okay. Thanks a lot, Mike. And Susumu for the introduction. So what I'm gonna do in today's talk is basically kind of a combination of explain my career as well as my scientific work in terms of how I connected Tarzan to Darwin and came to the conclusion that conservation and evolution actually ask the same question. They're called different things, but they're really the same thing.
Okay,
and so to
Fred,
begin with,
Fred, could you share your screen again?
oh, okay, so
it's
let's
not
see.
There.
Okay, let me Zoom. It's not there. Little glitches. How do I get back to Zoom? Don't know what happened here.
If you look for the Zoom icon on the toolbar on the bottom, you should be able to click
yeah, it's
on
telling me whether to join the meeting or cancel.
First, you have to go up and do the share screen. I think that'll.
Yeah, but I'm not getting a share. Boy, this is great. I'm not getting a share screen thing.
You're on Zoom already because you're talking with us, so it should be. If
Let me try this
you
one.
move the mouse around up on top there somewhere, it'll.
Yeah, but I'm not getting that screen.
You'll get a little green and red bar up on top.
That's what I had before, but I don't have it. Let me join the meeting again. Let me leave it or something and join it.
Okay.
No
See if
problem.
that works. Can you see it now?
It's coming. Yeah. Okay.
There you go.
And then full screen.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Okay, so you got it now?
Sorry about that. Yes.
Got it.
That's okay, it should work. Okay.
Mhm.
You're
So
good to
now let me
go.
go. So, sorry about that. So what I am going to do is kind of talk about how, in my mind, I linked my enthusiasm for Tarzan with my enthusiasm for Darwin to come to the conclusion that conservation and evolution are asking the same questions. And so I'm going to step through both the academic and personal pathways that I took to arrive at that conclusion. In order to do that, what I plan to do is take you to a few places that I've been in order to conduct research and address these questions about conservation and evolution, beginning with Los Angeles, California, where I grew up. So I grew up in West LA, and I went to Walgrove Avenue Elementary School, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen here. Can you see my cursor or not?
Yeah.
Oh, you could. Okay, so here's Walgrove Avenue Elementary School. The bubble over here is my house. This green area on the left-hand side was the Penmar Swamp. It was drained and it became a golf course. And I used to go there to collect frogs and bring them home because I love frogs, 5, 6, 7 years of age. I'd bring the frogs home. This part here where you can see the baseball diamonds was where I played Little League. And I'm beginning at Walgrove Avenue. I'm beginning my talk at Walgrove Avenue Elementary School because it features prominently in my future. When I grew up in the early 60s, it was the space age. This was man in the future. Everyone was looking forward to space. Our President John F. Kennedy said we'd land on the moon by 1970. On the left-hand side, you'll see the Jetsons. It was a popular cartoon. They were running around in spaceships. They had robots serving them food and cleaning the house. And on the right-hand side, in 1962, is a picture of Alan Shepard. He was the first US astronaut to go into space. The spaceship went up, it went down, and that was a major achievement. And because of all this emphasis on space, the future, and a positive perspective, my 6th grade class at Walgrove Avenue Elementary School had a theme for graduation on man and the future. So in those days, after the 6th grade, you went to junior high school, which was 7, 8, and 9, and then high school, which was 10, 11, and 12th grade. So in the 6th grade, we had a graduation ceremony. The theme was man in the future. And I was one of the 2 people who applied to give the graduation talk. My good friend Chuck Slossie was the other contestant. And he gave a talk about how the future would be like the Jetsons and Alan Shepard and all this. I gave a different talk. And what happened was he was chosen to give the talk to the graduating class and to the parents because even though my fellow students voted for me to give the talk, the faculty said my talk, and I remember this specifically, was too controversial and negative, and they would not allow it to be given at a graduation for the 6th grade. I was 11 years old to talk about man in the future. So the talk is 60 years old. It's a little blurry because it was written on a typewriter. And I'll just read you how it opened and how it closed to give you some insights into what I was thinking when I was 11 years old and what the school thought was very, very controversial and negative. So I couldn't say this. It was called Saving Our World. And I opened by saying the future concerns us all. We make the world what it is. Right now, there are many historical landmarks and wild animals around the world. But in 30 years, people may wonder what some of these things looked like. I went on, and I ended up closing by saying, man thinks about the conquest of space, but maybe he better solve the problems of the Earth first. The resources of the world are many, but in time they'll be used up. Our priceless heritage lies in preserving this planet. We must see to it that forthcoming generations see and enjoy the natural beauty of America and the world. So thank you for the opportunity to give that speech, because I couldn't do it in the 6th grade when I was 11. So now I get to at least say part of it. So thanks a bunch. Now, in the meantime, also simultaneous with me being a fanatic about, trying to save the planet, was I fell in love with Tarzan. Now, Tarzan of the Apes was originally published in a magazine in 1912. The book came out in 1914. That was the first one, called Tarzan of the Apes. It was a major hit. And the author, Edgar Rice Burroughs, ended up writing 26 Tarzan stories in 24 books. I bought them all. Ballantine Books published them. You'll see in the lower left-hand corner, the first 3, Tarzan, Return of Tarzan, The Beast of Tarzan. And I really and truly wanted to grow up to be Tarzan from the time I was 5 or 6 years old. To me, this was a dream. And by the way, I'm not the only primatologist to have this dream, because both Russ Minnemeyer and Jane Goodall actually had the same dream. And I'm sure there are others. But the Tarzan books were really a huge influence on my thinking and their thinking on saying, this would be really cool to live with a bunch of apes. Now, the Tarzan books were also put into a comic book form, which is on the right, the Gold Key comics. So, of course, I bought every one of those. And the Jewels for Opar, which you see the cover of there, was the 5th book in the series. And then he was made famous by Johnny Weissmuller, who was a 1912 Olympics champion swimmer in the picture on the top in a lot of the movies. And Johnny Weissmuller is recognized as Tarzan, like Sean Connery is recognized as James Bond. So there have been a bunch of different actors, but he was the key one. Now, the movies were a lot different than the books, which really annoyed me because I loved the books. In the movies, Tarzan had this friend chimp called Cheetah. In the books, he didn't. In the movies, he was like, oh, he could hardly talk. In the books, he spoke English, he spoke French. He also spoke ape talk. In fact, Tarzan in ape language means white skin. Edgar Rice Burroughs invented a whole language that the apes spoke to each other. So fast forward from elementary school to college, and I went to college at Berkeley. Got my undergraduate degree there. And one of my mentors at Berkeley was Sherwood Washburn, known as Sherry, those of us who work with him, and he was a fundamental influence in my life too. Now, for those of you who have attended some of the talks in the series, you may have heard his name before, because he was basically the father of American field studies of primates. He's the one who got things going in terms of studying monkeys as models for human evolution. One of his key students was Irvin DeVore, who most people have heard about, and a lot of people can trace their academic history to Irvin DeVore. So Washburn was actually one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. He had a contagious, childlike enthusiasm that brought people in to really wonder about the evolution of human behavior. I was totally mesmerized by Washburn himself. He offered me my first job in biological anthropology. Now, while at Berkeley, I did a lot of work with Washburn. I also took time out to try to figure out what the meaning of life by taking a break and doing other things besides going to the library, although I spent a lot of time in the library. Now, before Washburn hired me, he told me that he would offer me the job if he got the funding, and he did get the funding from the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. But he knew that I was going to take a summer off and go hiking by myself in the Sierra Nevadas in California. And the lower triangle is Yosemite National Park. The upper triangle is Mount Lassen. They're about 400 miles apart. And I decided to take one summer off. And it's about, like I said, a 400-mile trek, take like 2.5 months off. to hike by myself in the Sierra Nevadas. Now, before I left, one of the things Washburn said was I should read The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. Now, when you hike on a path like this, you have to watch very carefully what you put in your pack. My pack weighed about 1/3 of my body weight, which meant I was hiking with a 4-year-old on my back every day. You weigh out your food. You then get a food drop at a certain distance. But in my pack, I put The Origin of Species because Washburn said, if you want to pursue a career and you want to study primates in the wild, read The Origin of Species. And if your potential boss is going to hire you for your first job in biological anthropology, suggests you read a book, it's good that you read the book. So I did. And that was the first time I read The Origin of Species. And I can tell you, reading The Origin of Species in the Sierra Nevadas was the best place to read it for the first time, because I would be in the middle of nowhere by myself reading the book. There's no clock. There's really no time. Everything runs by sunset, sunrise. I had no set plan in terms of how far to walk in a day. I just knew that I had to get to my food, the next food drop, at a certain amount of time. So on average, if I had to cover like 10 miles a day and I walked 5 one day, I had to cover 15 the next day. But I could sit there and read the book, put it down, look around, and I was amazed by the diversity of wildlife and plants around me in the Sierra Nevadas. And I couldn't imagine this guy traveling around the world, looking at all these different things in the 1830s, thinking about evolution. And I became convinced that evolution by natural selection was what I wanted to pursue in my life. I wanted to study how the heck did all of these amazing creatures evolve. And one of the key things in The Origin of Species is that Darwin himself, and this is the 1830s, says that based upon his reasoning, plants and animals share a common ancestor. Now put yourself back in the 1830s. This guy had a phenomenal intellect to come to that conclusion, which we now know is true. So of course, at the time, I didn't know it was true. I knew nothing about genetics, nothing about evolution. I'm reading this book because Washburn told me to read it if I want to work for him. As simple as that. The book closes with a personal statement by Darwin, which I happen to agree with, or I wouldn't put it on the slide, because he found grandeur in life. He concluded that there are so many beautiful and wonderful forms that have evolved and are still evolving. And when I finished the book for the first time and I put it down, I thought, damn, this guy really knew a lot, and this is my calling. I want to study evolution. Kids are fascinated by animals. I was fascinated by animals. In the Sierra Nevadas, watching a bunch of chipmunks run around was amazing to me. It's like they're moving fast, they're shaking their tails, they're making these calls to each other. It's like, how the heck did that happen? Why are these chipmunks running around so fast? What's going on? And all these questions were just burning in my mind while I'm walking in the Sierra Nevadas, taking time out in the afternoons and in the evenings to read this book. And I thought, okay, I got to do something with evolutionary biology and the origin of humans. So I went on, fast forward, to do my PhD in Kenya. And this is what Mike was talking about, because my research site, or the research site I did, was right outside the town of Gilgil. Now, so the story with Mike, which he didn't tell you, was the research site was on Kopi Ranch, right near Gilgil. Gilgil was the closest town. It was about a 5-mile dirt road trip from the town to the little house that we were living in. And this was the era before internet and all of this stuff. It was male, and you hope and pray that you get to the right place at the right time and you're not lost. So I knew more or less Mike was coming because he had written he was more or less coming. And then one day he showed up in 1980. It's like, oh, so you're the guy who was writing here because you're interested in mate selection in Japanese monkeys. I'm interested in mate selection in baboons. What a coincidence. So we've been friends ever since then, and colleagues, because we have shared a common interest at the time. The research site itself was on a ranch, and it was begun in the early 1970s by two of Washburn's students. So Bob Harding was the first one who habituated the baboons, and he studied their feeding behavior. And he was followed by Shirley Strum, who did a detailed research on social relationships among the animals. And then she ended up finding out that the baboons hunt a lot of Thompson's gazelles, the Tommies, and they may be involved in cooperative hunting, which at the time people thought only chimps could do cooperative hunting because they're smart. Baboons are just monkeys. They really can't coordinate efforts. And Shirley's results said, well, maybe they're actually more cooperative than you think. Maybe they're smarter than people think. And she actually gave a talk at Berkeley it was like a pre-interview talk before she got the job at UC San Diego. She was a graduate student, and Washburn invited me to her talk. So I was an undergraduate, went to hear Shirley Strum talk about the baboons. And the whole time she was talking about baboons and what they were doing, I was not paying attention, I will admit, to anything she said. What I was thinking to myself was, this is amazing. She's living among baboons. She's being Tarzan. This is what I want to do. How the heck could I do this? And I never thought when I was a senior at Berkeley that I'd be able to actually do it, but I did. So I managed to get out to Gilgil to do my PhD work on baboons. So I spent close to 2.5 years in Kenya, but 19 months of that was devoted to my PhD, where I collected about 3,000 hours of data, primarily on the mating behavior of the baboons, because by the time I went to the field, I had also read Darwin's other famous book, which is The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, otherwise known as sexual selection. So when I got to Kenya, I had read Sexual Selection a few times. I had read The Origin of Species a few times. I was totally focused on sex. What is going on here? And that was the nature of my PhD. One of the more intriguing things about the baboons, which is totally bizarre to me, was that the females have this sex skin swelling. It made no sense when you think about it. It's like, so their butt swells up in size every once in a while. It's like, what the heck? It's like a really weird thing when you think about it. The baboons are one of the few mammals, like women, that menstruate. In most mammals, what happens is when the uterus gets prepped for a pregnancy, a bunch of blood collects. If they don't become pregnant, it's reabsorbed in the system and disappears, and they don't shed it. But baboons are like people. They shed it. They menstruate. This is a baboon menstruating. The gray area just to the sides, right above there's is called the pericolossal skin. So baboons are one of the few primates that menstruate. They menstruate, and then they have this sex skin swelling I was telling you about, which is really pronounced. Now, for those of you who are familiar or have watched the Japanese macaques, their sex skins turn red, but they don't get as big as this in their hind end. Baboons get really big. They go through, they don't mate seasonally like Japanese macaques. They mate all year round. And when they become pregnant, pericolossal skin turns pink, a reddish pink. So if you go to Africa, you're on safari, you see a baboon, if this pericolossal skin is gray, she's not pregnant. If it's pink, she's pregnant. It's as simple as that. They advertise their sexual state. Now, one of my hobbies as a kid, which continues to this day, is I love drawing, especially cartoons. I love painting. I love doing artwork. And I used to sketch baboon sex skins. And I scored them. This was before the era of the digital camera, on a particular scale, which ranged from flat, this female is flat, to fully swollen, which got up to, I called it 59. So there are increments of like tens. And each one was divided, so it'd be 10, 12, 14. You could have different numbers. This one here happens to have been a 48. It's like close to this one, not as big as this one, because this area over here could have been larger. So I would track them every day, all the females in the troop, and record their sex skin size. When they got big, they would form a consortship, or the males would mate guard the females, like here. So here's a male, bigger than the females. This female has a sex skin swelling. You can barely see it here, but it's here. And then this guy over here is called a follower. I'm not going to talk about followers. Sometimes they're in the front, but basically, this is the male that's mate guarding this female. They're in a consort relationship. It also turned out that the sex skin tracks hormone levels very closely. So baboon hormones are like the same hormones in women and a lot of mammals. What happens is, in essence, estrogen here climbs, it peaks as progesterone starts climbing. There's an ovulation event, then they both drop. If there's no pregnancy, menstruation comes. If there is pregnancy, the progesterone continues high. Ovulation occurs around here. The sex skin tracks pretty closely. The size of the sex skin tracks very closely the probability of ovulation, which is determined by the relative ratio of estrogen to progesterone. And the reason that's the case is because the sex skin, even though it's mostly water, has a ton of estrogen and progesterone receptors. And in order for these hormones to have an effect, the hormones have to occupy a receptor. So if there's a lot of estrogen receptors that are occupied, then the sex skin begins to swell. Once progesterone starts climbing and occupies the progesterone receptors, and the estrogen ones go away, the sex skin goes down. So the sex skin size itself is very closely linked to the hormone levels, which are very closely tied to the probability of ovulation. How close are they? Well, the graph doesn't show it, but I can tell you, by the time I ended my study, I could actually predict in some females when they were likely to stop their sex skin swelling, which was called day 0. The day before they go down is -1. The day before that's -2, -3, and so forth. So going back in my records, what I found out was they're at their maximum size for a mode of 2 days, rarely more than 3. Now, this was different than how a lot of people scored sex skins, which was on a scale of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Mine was way more fine-tuned. In addition, age influenced the sex skin because males didn't even start to consort with young or adolescent females until their sex skin surpassed the maximum size of older females. So male consorts were dependent upon the size of sex skin swellings, which advertised the probability of ovulation and were influenced by their age. Now, the message to students is I never could publish that in a refereed journal because they kept saying it was too subjective. So I ended up publishing it in a chapter which was still reviewed. But it's difficult sometimes to crack through the academic dogma. Now, what I am fortunate, and I think it's really cool without sounding too self-important, is now that there's digital photographs and all this other stuff and fecal hormones which weren't invented at the time, what I found has been confirmed. It wasn't just a subjective impression. I had no basis for making a subjective impression that the bigger the size, the more likely they are to ovulate. But that's what the data showed. In fact, not only was it more likely to ovulate, but it determined male reproductive strategies. as well as female choice. So back to the sexual selection part, which is what I was talking to Mike about when he came out to Kenya in 1980, was it turns out that a lot of these consorts are formed depending upon what females do to males beforehand. So males are more likely to form a consort relationship with a female that grooms them, and they're more likely to form a consort relationship with a female that presents to them when they're starting to swell. That's what these two graphs show. And in biology, there's no absolutes other than the fact that animals will die. And so some males form consorts with females, even though those females don't groom them. And some males do not form consorts, even though the females do groom them. But the overall trend, not even a trend, it's a statistically significant relationship between animals, is males are more likely to form a consort with a female who grooms them and presents to them, which in my mind demonstrated female choice does have an impact on who forms a consort relationship. But consort relationships are not only determined by female choice. It turns out males are quite selective. They're more aggressive in terms of trying to obtain a female on the two most likely days when females will ovulate, and they form coalitions on the two most likely days that female will ovulate. So male selectivity is partly based upon the probability of ovulation and on who the female is. So what happened was ended up publishing a few papers on this, confirming that Darwin was right. I always like finding that Darwin's right, because mating was not promiscuous. They do have preferences. And it also turns out that one of the papers that I wrote that was never published and will never be published, because now it's too late to publish it, was actually the details on male mate selection depending upon female choice itself. So it was a condition-dependent selection and the probability of ovulation. And it was not published because at the time the criticism was Fred Bercovitch has no clue what sexual selection is about. Males will mate with any female that's receptive. They do not select. So the only way I could get my ideas in print was to sneak them in. And so, for example, in the article on female cooperation, which you see at the top, if you read the last line, it says that the male mating success depends more, upon what males are doing than females, which it does. Now, 20 years after my PhD came out, and after people were telling me I didn't understand sexual selection, there have been a lot of papers now published on how male mate selection is actually a component of sexual selection. So we'll go back to Darwin's writings, and then I'll go ahead to the next thing, which is in the book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. He specifically sets forth the conditions when you would expect male mate selection. People cite the book without reading the book. They cite the book in misleading statements, not just sexual selection, but the origin of species. In the 6th edition of the Origin of Species at the end, Darwin has a point that people have misrepresented what he said. And so he quotes from the first chapter and the last chapter and says, I didn't say natural selection was responsible for everything, only most things. Same thing with sexual selection. People quote Darwin without understanding what Darwin said. So my PhD actually had a chapter on male mate selection, male competition, female mate selection, female competition. I could not publish the stuff on male mate selection because I was told I was an idiot. Males don't select mates. Anyway, moving on from the baboons and my work there, I was really just totally awed by the fact that these sex scans revealed reproductive state, but had no clue what a hormone was. It was all from literature. And I thought, if I'm going to know more and understand the evolution of this really weird phenomenon, I better know more about hormones. And I got a postdoc at the Wisconsin, it's now called the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center, to study reproductive endocrinology and developmental biology. And I learned how to do hormone assays. And using that information, I went to the next place we're going after I got my postdoc, which is the Caribbean Primate Research Center in Puerto Rico. study rhesus monkeys. So I wanted to study rhesus monkeys to see how their hormones and behavior and morphology are linked to sexual selection. Again, this is the evolutionary thing, nothing to do with conservation. After all, baboons are widespread, rhesus macaques are widespread. They're not endangered species. So the Cayo Santiago and the Caribbean Primate Research Center began with the Cayo Santiago rhesus monkeys, and there were 400 monkeys that were brought in 1938 on this ship, the USS Cuomo, caught in 12 different locations in India. And the original research, well, they were brought there in 1938, key research started in the mid-1950s by a guy you might have heard of called Stuart Altman. Now, Stuart Altman did his PhD on the rhesus monkeys at Cayo Santiago, and his PhD was called the Sociobiology of Rhesus Monkeys. Now, Stuart Altman's PhD advisor was E.O. Wilson at Harvard. He returned to Cayo Santiago in 2004 for a documentary movie. But between his studies in 1956 and the documentary in 2004, what happened was the Caribbean Primate Research Center was actually starving for money, a bit moribund, and kind of destined for failure, except two people, Matt Kessler, who's on the left, and Rich Rollins, who's on the right, decided it was too important and they had to do something. And those two really were instrumental in getting Cayo Santiago back on the map and the Caribbean Primate Research back in the game of studying behavior, biology of monkeys. One of the ways they did this was they edited a book published in 1986 about the Cayo Santiago macaques. Then 2 years later, they had the 50th anniversary in 1988 of establishment of the Caribbean Primate Research Center. And the Caribbean Primate Research Center has two main places to study monkeys. One is this is the Sabana Seca Station. I studied the monkeys in this big enclosure here. They're called Group M. They came from Cayo Santiago, and then they were moved to these three on the right. When I went for my job interview, I stayed. There was a tiny little one-bedroom apartment up here. And the Sabana Seca Field Station is on a Navy base where monkeys came from Cayo Santiago, which is more well-known than Sabana Seca. But my work was both at Cayo Santiago and Sabana Seca. And this is the island of Cayo Santiago. And so it's about 1 kilometer off the coast. This is Punta Santiago. This is the mainland of Puerto Rico. Over here, this is the big Kai, the little Kai. That's what the island looks like. And so I went there to study hormones, behavior, and whatnot, and rhesus monkeys. One of the studies we did in terms of hormones behavior was I found out that the rhesus monkeys have a very distinctive mating season. And during the mating season, the estrogen levels went up in the males. Everyone looks at testosterone. We looked at estrogen. So did their fat levels. And this made sense from an evolutionary perspective because they were putting on fat before engaging in the energetic expenditures of reproduction. During the mating season, they fed less. They were running around keeping tabs on females. They were trying to control access to females. They would sometimes be aggressive towards other males. All those things are energetically expensive. They can't do all that and eat at the same time. So the rhesus monkeys would be putting on fat before the mating season in order to engage in these reproductive strategies during the mating season. And it then turned out, because we went into genetics, that those males who were fatter at the start of the mating season, not obese, but fatter, produced more offspring. Matt had a lot of foresight, Matt Kessler, and he established a tight collaboration with a lot of German geneticists. And then I developed a close network with a few of them to study the details of paternity analysis, because the rhesus monkey females mate with more than one male. So we had distinct pedigrees of females. We didn't know who the father was. So Peter Nurnberg, who became a professor at University of Cologne and just retired, was my key contact. And his graduate student was Anja Wittig, who's now at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and she's in charge of the behavioral ecology section. And we used what we thought at the time, and which was the long-term data. The longitudinal analysis was 6 years of data. And we found using the paternity analysis that there's a lot of reproductive skew. I'll read my cheat sheet here, that over a 6-year period, looking at 247 infants, about 25% were sired by non-troop males, and 6 males were responsible for siring 80% of the infants. A couple of take-home messages. One is when people are looking at dominance and reproductive success, it's a weird situation when you have non-troop males siring offspring because they have no dominance rank. So just from a theoretical perspective, if you're focused on dominance and reproduction, you've excluded a quarter of your sires by just looking at the males in the group, if there's a lot of this extra group sirehood, which there was on Cayo Santiago. They also had other species at the primate center. None of the work I did on the rhesus monkeys after spending a dozen years there got public recognition, but the study on Patis monkeys did. This is a Patis monkey. This is the underside of a male Patis monkey. They have blue scrotum. So I thought, rhesus monkeys turn red. Is the blue affected by testosterone? We found out blue color was not affected by testosterone. Even though testosterone increases during the mating season and so does testicle size, the blue color doesn't change. And I established that by using Sherwin-Williams paint cards, because I had no money to do research, and matching the scrotal color to the Sherwin-Williams paint card color. And this one got a lot of publicity, of all things. I also sent my article to the Sherwin-Williams Paint Company and said, you're free to use it in advertising if you want to show how versatile your paint cards are, but I never heard back from them. Then we go back to America. Well, Puerto Rico is part of America, but back to Southern California, San Diego. So I left the Caribbean Primate Research Center and I got a job in San Diego at the Center for Reproduction of Endangered Species. Now, the Center for Reproduction of Endangered Species is now known as the Institute for Conservation Research. And here's where the conservation and evolution part gelled. Because I'd been studying rhesus monkeys and baboons for 15 years. They're not an endangered species. I was looking at the reproductive strategies and sexual selection in those two species. I'm invited for a job interview at an organization that's aimed at conserving endangered species. And the question is, how do you market yourself as an evolutionary biologist to conservation science? And the way I did that was to show that conservation and evolution ask the same question as their basic foundation. The question that you would need to answer for conservation is, what determines variation in reproductive success? Because the answer to that question will determine not only the reproductive rates of the population, but the population trends, growth, and where they're living. In evolutionary biology, you ask the same question. So I got the job. Back to Darwin. He didn't promote conservation, but he knew what was going on. And he was great at phrasing things. The red's my emphasis. Darwin, within the first dozen pages of The Origin of Species, doesn't mince words. He notes that the question about why one species is wide-ranging and one isn't depends upon the relationship with other species. In modern day lingua, that's ecosystem dynamics. And that the future of those species and I'll emphasize, every inhabitant of the world depends upon that. He didn't say most. He didn't say a lot. Every single inhabitant of the world's success depends upon ecosystem relationships among other species in the planet. Now, that's his evolutionary take. I don't see any difference from that in the conservation take. He was spot on without using the word conservation. So while at the zoo, I studied a bunch of animals, and the ones I'll talk about in this, or the ones I'll go over in this talk, are koalas and giraffe. Why koalas? Well, Darwin was in Australia for about 10 days. He never saw a koala, so he had no idea that what he wrote about animals applied to koalas. But it turns out what he did, in effect, say in sexual selection was males are stinky and noisy, and it helps their reproduction. And it turns out koalas are also stinky and noisy, so this is what I studied at the zoo and in Australia. I'll come back to giraffes in a minute, but we'll do koalas first. So koalas have a scent gland. If you go to Australia and you see an animal that has a brown mark on its chest, that's a scent gland. Females don't have this. It's only males. If you subject the scent glands, or you take samples and you subject them to mass spectrometry, you get this graph that nobody understands. So there's a whole bunch of lines, and even if you don't know anything about it, you'll see that some lines are in the mating season, or there's a bunch of lines going high, and during the non-mating season there aren't. That's just because there's more chemicals that are active in the mating season than the non-mating season. These scents are also individually specific. So each male has their own scent. It changes with age. It changes in the mating season and the non-mating season. And one of the more fascinating things, because I didn't even understand what half these chemicals are, was of the 45 compounds, one of them was glycerol. And the reason that's fascinating to me was because glycerol has a high boiling point, so it means the scent stays around for a long time because it doesn't flow out in the atmosphere. Males mark the base of trees. That means any female that comes to the tree and sniffs it will know who's there. And this study was done in collaboration with Jennifer Tobey, and Jen is still at the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance. And she went to Australia with us a couple of times. Like I said, I was a combination of Australia and San Diego. So we're in Australia. So we'll go over to Australia, and the research site's off the coast of the Queensland, northeast corner, island called St. Bees. And you'll see there's an area called Homestead Bay with 3 black dots on it. Those are buildings. We used to stay there. We couldn't fly in. The island's too small, but this is a picture showing you basically the research site. And the research site, Homestead Bay, is this bay. During the low tide, this is all a mud flat, but most of the study, a lot of it was done on this area, which is called the knoll, and I'll show you a map of that later. So we studied the koalas here and tried to link it to conservation science. And koalas in the zoo, you could easily see. In the wild, sometimes they're not that easy to see. They're kind of gray colored like eucalyptus trees, and sometimes it's thick. You can't even see the researcher who's going through the bush to try to find the koala. So I worked a lot with Bill Ellis. He was hired. I hired him actually as a postdoctoral research affiliate of the zoo. And we caught koalas. We'd weigh them. We'd measure them. We'd take blood samples. We should put GPS units on them and VHF trackers so we could see where they were going. And as an example, so this again is the knoll. Here's Homestead Bay. In the pre-breeding season, the females are wandering all over the place. The breeding season, they confine their wanderings to a smaller area. And then during the birth peak, when they have the little joeys, they even wander less. So what's going on? Well, one thing, I already mentioned the scent. Remember, the males are smelly. They're also vocal. So if this works, you'll hear, this is the mating call of a male koala. Can you hear that?
I think you need to click on the little box when you share the screen.
Oops. Oh, well.
So
New share?
we can try again if you like.
Try again. Okay, I'll stop it. What do I do? It's new share.
Yeah, new share.
New share, share sound, share. Okay,
Yeah,
let's
share sound. That's it.
hear it now. So that That's the mating call of a male koala. Females find it really cool. And over here, Bill he's monitoring. This is a remote sensor, so we could record who's calling, where, and when. And what we did find was that number of bellows influence how far females travel. But the key finding really was that female choice is important in koalas because they do move a lot when the males are calling. Males don't compete a lot. And male-female associations are way more likely during the mating season. So it turns out that in koalas, it's kind of a combination of non-agonistic competition among males because they use calls and scents, and female choice. Now, the male calls are related to the individual. As I mentioned, they're individually distinctive, as well as to male size, because the vocal tract is related to male size. So females can judge male size. They can judge who it is. We're assuming they can judge it. We don't know if they actually think about this and play eeny, meeny, miny, mo, but we know that that's the effect of what they do. The next stop is back to San Diego so we can see the giraffe. So the giraffe, what happened? I'll have to talk a little faster. So did a study of the giraffe at the Wild Animal Park, which is now called the Safari Park. And what we found was that the animals don't hang around randomly. Now, at the time we did the study, people thought giraffe associations were just random. There were 6 females in the group. We did a social network analysis, a very simple approach here, looking at the dyadic associations. The stars on the drawing, the diagram on the right, are mothers and daughters. And the thickness represents how often they hung around each other. Essentially, what this is a question of how often do A and B stay together versus how often they're not together. And we found there was a significant relationship there. It was not random. In fact, findings ended up becoming one of the top 100 science stories of 2002 because Discover magazine thought this was really cool. People thought everything was random, like a bunch of bird flocks, and it wasn't. And I'll come back to this in a minute. But just to let you know, so that was one study. The other thing we did was we were looking, like I did with the baboon, on mate guarding by males and female reproductive state. So we collected fecal samples. Giraffe are non-seasonal breeders like baboons. The diamond here is a birth. These are pregnane levels, fecal pregnane levels. They go through multiple cycles. The upside down triangles are when the male would mate guard and copulate with the female. Most of this work was done with Meredith Bashaw. She used this for her PhD, then became a professor at Franklin and Marshall College. And among the papers that we wrote, one of them actually suggested that giraffe actually live in a fission-fusion social system, using the information we had about the social relationships that were non-random. And we also suggested that males could detect the reproductive state of females using the Flamen response, and that they rarely copulate, but that the hormone levels of the females were detectable to males. So male mate guarding was strongly dependent on females, so they weren't wasting their time and effort in females who weren't likely to conceive. Meredith called this the duh research because it was like, duh, of course males are interested in females to have sex. But I mentioned Discover magazine thought this was a great study. Criticism was, people told me it's only because they're captive animals. They're living in a zoo. That's why they associate non-randomly. And I'm thinking, I'm not sure about this. Why would giraffe have a latent ability to associate non-randomly? Only it becomes apparent in the zoo. You mean this doesn't happen in the wild? Which brings me to the wild. So I was in Zambia. I was looking for a research site to study wild dogs. And through a mutual acquaintance, I went to, there's Zambia in the middle, to South Luangwa National Park, Mafui Lodge in South Luangwa, to meet up with a guy named Philip Berry, because this mutual acquaintance says, oh, he's been out there for like 30, 40 years. He collects information on rhinos, leopards, giraffe. You might want to touch base with him. So I visited him in South Luangwa National Park. and this is Cuyenda Base Camp, which he founded. I asked him about giraffe, and he kind of laughed, and he brought out this article that was published in BBC Wildlife ages ago and said, it's not even a question. He's not a scientist. He had tons of data. He meticulously recorded, but he didn't subject it to any kind of analysis, and came to the conclusion that they do hang around with their friends. And I thought, oh, this is really cool. So I collaborated with him for about a dozen years, analyzing his data, collecting more data, saying, so what's going on with giraffe in the wild? One of the things you have to recognize about giraffe in the wild, like with other animals, is they're individually distinctive. So primatologists tend to think, oh yeah, primates are, you can tell primates apart. Well, you can tell giraffe apart too. You can actually tell koalas apart if you study them enough, but this is an example. So if you look at this giraffe on the left, the area within the circle, and you look at the white part, it's kind of like an upside down figure for playing the game hangman. But just look at the white part right by where the neck meets the shoulder. Now look at this one. It's not at all similar. Those two, you know, are two distinct giraffes because the spot patterns on the left side of the neck, just above the shoulder, are different. Now the middle one on the right side, on the left shoulder has something that looks like a paw print. Look at the one next to him, it looks like a flying bat. So now you know you've got three different giraffes. When you see these are female, when you see them again, you know you're looking at the same. If you see a giraffe that has a bat on the left shoulder, that's this same female, no question. So Phil had data going back to the early 1970s based on individual giraffe that we could then plug into systematic programs to say, hey, do they have a fission-fusion social system? And the answer was yes, they do. So we did figure out the dyadic association index of these individuals wasn't that high. And we found out that most herds, and we reported this for the first time, are actually made up of family members because we had the long-term data. We knew the individuals. We knew who the mothers and daughters were over a 30, 40-year period. And you might look at the graph and say, hang on. The non-kin social association is 0.2. On the right-hand side, the mother and the adult daughter is 0.3. It's like, man, that's not much of a difference, but it's a 50% difference. That means basically mothers and adult daughters are 1.5 times more likely to be in a herd than non-kin. That was significant. And the same thing, but even more pronounced with peers. So they don't breed seasonally, but the ones they grow up with and they spread their wings and wander around are the ones that they form herds with. Females. Now males, I mentioned earlier, they're wandering around looking for females. So you don't see males in a herd too consistently. Most herds have a lot of females. Sometimes males are with females, sometimes they're not. So males are alone about 70% of the time. Females are alone about 8% of the time. They hang around with their family and friends. Males are wandering around looking for who to mate with. Differences in reproductive strategies, which relate to reproductive success, which relate to conservation. So, as in the case with koalas, published a few papers and just highlighting a couple here. One is that we were one of the original ones to say, actually, giraffe have a fission-fusion social system. This was also met with a negative reaction from the fieldwork because the previous idea, and a lot of people, unfortunately, still subscribe to the idea that fission-fusion systems require gigantic, monumental, humongous brains to evaluate relationships. And so only smart animals with big brains like cetaceans and elephants and chimpanzees can have this kind of society. Now that viewpoint is gradually going by the wayside because people have reported fission-fusion systems in fish. But when we published this, it wasn't easy. It was rejected by a few journals before it was connected because of the idea that giraffe were too stupid. Now, as an aside, it turns out their relative brain size is about the same, if not bigger, than elephants. But that's a whole different talk. So it's true, elephants have gigantic brains, but elephants are also big animals. Sperm whales have gigantic brains, but they're big animals. Ants have gigantic brains relative to body size, but they're tiny animals, so they have little, mini, tiny brains. So they did live in a fission-fusion society. And one of the other key things that we came up with was what determines reproductive success? And the answer for females was how long you live. And so we reported that longevity is a key to female reproductive success. And that finding isn't unique among mammals. It was new for giraffe because we were the only ones that had the data, but it also occurs in a number of other species like elephants, baboons, red deer, and a few others. After San Diego, I came to, whoops, went too fast there. I came to Japan. As Mike mentioned, I came to Japan, and it was in, I came here to Japan in 2009 or 10, but basically it was to help launch the SciCast program, the Center for International Collaboration, Advanced Studies in Primatology. And I was one of the ones to basically come to Japan and help work on that program. And while I was in Japan, I had the good, I would say the good, I was really lucky because I was able to mentor a lot of students, some officially, some unofficially, including these individuals here. Engaged in a lot of different projects, from personality in bonobos to hormones in bonobos, hormones and behavior in loris, hormones and behavior in Japanese macaques, baboon crop raiding, gorilla ecotourism, and even giraffe. Those of you who know Miho, she studied giraffe. So I even got to mentor a student who was interested in giraffe, SciCast. Now, after Japan, came back to the States, and I'm coming towards the end of my talk here, or the end of my science and autobiography, to bring in a trip to Europe. So I went to Switzerland to attend a conference. Giraffe are an endangered species. The IUCN has a red list of endangered species, and the way the IUCN operates is they have specialist groups. And these specialist groups do an assessment. Everything's really bureaucratic. So the specialist groups do an assessment. The assessment is turned over to the IUCN Red List Assessment Group. They decide how valid it is, whether it's listed or not, and then it gets listed. So I was part of the Giraffe and Copy Specialist Group, about 18 of us. We compiled all the information we could on the population sizes, the trends, the geographic distribution of giraffe. And you have to have a starting point, and basically the starting point is 3 generations ago. So we compared the best information over the last 30 years, giraffe generation is about 10 years, and found that the numbers were going down. They're going down in the last 30 years by about 40%. So we classified, we recommended they be categorized as vulnerable, which the IUCN did. Now, as a side note, and this is kind of a warning to students about how the system operates, is that when people say they discover a new species of primate, or they name a new species of primate, then that species is not listed automatically on the red list. If you claim a new species, it has to be accepted. The red list assessment has to progress. The IUCN has to say it's okay. So if the name is totally changed, it is not listed. And I'll come to that again when I talk about why I was in Geneva, because it's a critical thing that a lot of scientists actually and students don't quite realize in terms of the real world. But anyway, so giraffe are vulnerable animals. So how vulnerable are they? How many giraffe are there? Well, so let's compare them to some well-known species. Elephants, there are probably about 350,000, more or less. I'm rounding off, elephants in the world. And we all know elephants are in danger. People kill them for their tusks. How about giraffes? Well, there's less than 100,000 giraffes. You know, a third of the number of giraffes is elephants, but they're certainly not given the publicity that elephants are. Chimps. A lot of primatologists listening to this. Okay, how many chimps are there? Raise your hand. Yes? No? One? Twice? No. 1/3 or so. 3.5 times as many chimps as there are giraffes, and chimps are endangered species. Now, I'm not saying elephants and giraffes shouldn't be listed, But everyone knows chimps and elephants are endangered. Giraffes, they're not sure. How about the ones I studied? The thorn-crossed giraffe in Zambia? About as many as there are mountain gorillas. Not that numerous. There's 9 subspecies. 5 of them have populations of less than 1,500. That's a tiny number of individuals. 4 of them are over that amount. So the overall trend is to decrease in size. Given that reduction in size, I was invited to attend. It's a real long name, but it's the CITES COP18, which is the 18th meeting of the Conference of the Parties of the Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species, a real mouthful. So this is the team that I work with. And the way it works at CITES is it's basically government. The CITES is an international treaty. So the governments have to agree with each other on what to do in terms of the trade in endangered species. Trade is both live animals and animal parts. So 6 countries petitioned, get giraffe listed on Appendix 2. There are 3 appendices, and they wanted them listed on Appendix 2. So they invited me to attend. I had 3 minutes to attend. I can tell you more about that later if you want to know, but basically to list them on Appendix 2. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes. When the vote came, over 80% of the countries, there was 183 countries, voted to list them. And this was great because now giraffe are listed on CITES Appendix 2. Appendix 1 means more strict rules. Appendix 2 is medium and Appendix 3 is less. Most primates are listed on Appendix 1. But this gets back to what I was saying with the IUCN, which is independent of CITES. And an example recently is the pygmy slow loris. So Nycticebus is listed under Appendix 1, which means it's a very important species to preserve, to save, to protect. However, the proposal to change the genus means if successful, they're no longer listed. That means you can trade in that species without any problem whatsoever. So you open a possible Pandora's box to increasing the trade in a very endangered species by changing its taxonomic name. Just think about that. So back to Tarzan. Tarzan and Darwin. I open with Darwin, and I'm getting towards the close, and I'll mention something about Tarzan. What the heck does he have to do with conservation? Well, for one thing, Tarzan lived among the animals. He spoke to the animals. In book number 8 of the 24 books, called Tarzan the Terrible, he was captured. He was held in a dungeon. And while he was in the dungeon, he had a few thoughts, which are on this slide, about how precarious this paradise was where he was captured. And he thought human beings might destroy the world. He didn't think that was a good idea. So you have to read the book to figure out what happened. But I'd recommend before you read Tarzan the Terrible, just read Tarzan of the Apes. It's a great book. Read Origin of Species, read Sexual Selection. And if you really want to know academically how they're related, then I suggest you read this article that just came out in Primates, because one of the key topics where conservation and evolution are actually twins has to do with incest avoidance. Both of them come together precisely in an academic perspective in this question of to what extent is inbreeding detrimental. So I have to say a few words about the Ann Innes Dagg Foundation, where I'm associated, because giraffes are endangered. Ann is called the Jane Goodall of the giraffes, but actually Jane Goodall should be called the Ann Innes Dagg of chimpanzees, because Ann started her study in 1956, which is 3 years before George Schaller went to study gorillas, and 4 years before Jane actually went to study the chimps. She's a real pioneer, so you should read more about her. But to return to where I started in terms of conservation, evolution, Darwin, and Tarzan, I just wanted to repeat what Charles Darwin wrote, because it's been a guiding light, not just his literature, but what he said and the way he expressed it in terms of my research, my life, and the message I'd like to pass on to the students, because we do only have one planet. People are talking about exploring Mars. The heck with Mars. When I was 11 years old, I said, the heck with the space. We only have a limited amount of space here. And if you look around you, it's pretty awesome, the diversity of animals and plants that have evolved. And whether we're talking about chimps or Komodo dragons or giraffe or people, kids love animals. And I think we have an obligation to make sure that kids can pretend to be Tarzan. It drove me to conservation. It drove Jane Goodall to conservation. It drove Russ Minnemeyer to conservation. And I'm sure it drove others to conservation because we had the opportunity to be little Tarzans and experience this wonderful and awesome planet of tons of animals and plants and just getting lost in nature. Thanks for attending. And I guess it's question and answer time or whatever we do now, Susumo, but appreciate everybody attending and hope you learned something.
Thanks, Fred. That was wonderful. Really, really nice. Just what we always want to have. It was a good talk.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Fred. We can take some questions from the audience. So if you are on Zoom, you can either raise your hand if you want to speak up or use the chat board. And people who are watching this on YouTube can use the chat board there.
So you're gonna let me know which questions to answer? What I'll let you handle this.
Sure, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry for the technical difficulties here. Some of us have a PhD and don't understand any of this.
Hey, Fred, let me shoot one off to you if you don't mind.
Sure.
To get us started. So towards the end, you're talking about what happens when you change species names, taxonomic identifiers, and how they could potentially get delisted. Do you have any examples so far of like recent? Because one thing that I recently did a podcast on it with Elaine Guevara at Duke, who was talking about the primate eponyms, for example, and how so many of the names are associated with like currently undesirable colonial histories. And there's a movement to try and reassign names, to avoid those kind of things. So I think it's quite topical now. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Sure,
Wow.
Andrew.
Yeah.
So I can't give you any examples of where it's happened. What I'm doing is simply, at this point, firing a warning shot to say the difficulty, because on the one hand, people want to change names, either because it's a new species, to avoid colonial, whatever, because they want to become famous. There's multiple reasons for declaring a new species. But the cost of doing that is if it's accepted as a new species, you begin at square one if you want it listed, either on the CITES appendix or the IUCN Red List, because they're two independent measures. And so if you're successful, for example, and you change the Latin nomenclature, then that species is not listed anymore, period, that's it. So then you have to start listing the species, or the process of listing the species, because there's not an automatic transition process to say, for example, I'll use Papio, the baboons as an example. If instead of Papio anubis, I decide to call it Andrew anubis, then Andrew, I mean, they're common species, so they're not listed anyway, but Andrew anubis doesn't appear. So I have to start again saying Andrew anubis. And it is specific in a case that recently, because of work with one of the SciCap students about the Pygmy slow and there was a movement to change the genus name, which is more fundamental than the species name, because Nycticebus species are listed. Doesn't matter the species name, the genus is listed. But if you change the genus name, you're not listed on CITES or the red list. So if you're not listed, there's no government rules or regulation to control the international trade, and there's no recognition that it's an endangered species because it's a new one. You have to start the process again. So it's basically a caveat and a warning that even though it might seem like the right thing to do or the proper thing to do to rename something, there might be a big cost in doing this because it's no longer an endangered species, technically. I mean, realistically, biologically, nothing's changed. But from the technical point of view, from the political point of view, it's changed a lot.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about the kind of legislation around that and what would have to happen. Thanks.
Sure. Oh yeah,
Sure.
let's see this. Let's see. Yeah, there's a, but it says it's on mute. How do you do this?
I
You
can.
unmute
I
yourself. There you go.
got it sorted. Yeah, I'm unmuted. Hello.
Okay. Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing great now. That's definitely a great start to my morning over here. That was a fascinating talk. I was a little bit curious and concerned that this would end up being a talk about how Darwin and Tarzan actually had the same style of loincloth or something. But I think the connections that you made were much more meaningful and fascinating. I was also today years old when I learned that there's a scrotum blue shade on paint cards. So that was also really exciting to see. I have more of kind of a general question, actually. Quite literally. So I'm always really delighted to see established researchers who have had incredible careers that have such a varied repertoire of research species. So, you mentioned koalas, elephants, primates. I see also you've looked at California condors, wild dogs. And my background so far in my very early career has been entomology, herpetology, and now parasitology of invasive raccoon dogs. And I always feel a little bit self-conscious as an early, career researcher that it kind of looks like I can't make up my mind about what to study. But the truth is, for me, I see a lot of overlap and a lot of connections in these things that I'm studying. Do you have any comments or advice for early career researchers who have these sort of, not a specific research species or a highly specific, research field that they want to pursue, but rather have these broad ranging interests? And do you see merit to generalists, to research generalists?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a personal choice, to tell you the truth. So I know people who have been studying the same animal for 50 years on that, silverback generation. And they know those animals upside down, inside out, backwards and forwards, and every which way. I chose a different path. To me, the diversity was fascinating. And if you really want to key in diversity, then I would say read Darwin, read The Origin of Species. He spent 8 years studying barnacles. He wrote a 2-volume book, which is the most boring book in the world, where he describes all the different species of barnacles. And that was one of the things which actually turned him on to variation, because it was hard to pigeonhole barnacles into specific species because they're so variable. Where do you draw the line between varieties, subspecies, races, and species? It's tough. And so to me, what was fascinating in terms of Tarzan and Darwin was the way that evolution works and the diversity of things that come out from 4 amino acids. I mean, this is amazing. I mean, it's like you gotta be joking. This 4 amino acids, and depending on how they're put together and what sort of a sequence and how they match, they make everything from poison ivy to human brains. And so that's what I would say, stick with it if you're interested in the breadth and diversity. Because one of the things which I found fascinating, I'm sure you will as you progress, is there's a lot of overlap and similarity between some things, and there's a lot of differences. And the intriguing thing is, so why are some things the same? Why is it that testosterone, for example, if you're looking at testosterone in a dog, it's the same as in a giraffe. It's the same as in an elephant. It's the same as in a person. It's like, why the hell did testosterone stay the same? Why doesn't it change? And then estrogen comes from testosterone. That's really weird too. Why the heck? But it works. And depending upon these tiny little minuscule amounts, it changes a lot. And so instead of saying you can't make up your mind, it's more like, no, my mind is made up. These creatures are fantastic because they've somehow evolved a little bit different, but maintaining a little bit of the same. And what's really crucial to understand is, so what was the mechanism causing that divergence? Why is it that some of them changed slightly? What did they accomplish? I mean, not that they were thinking about accomplishing anything, but I think you get the point. So I would definitely not take it as a negative to have a broad interest in what you're talking about in all these areas. I would take it as a positive. It's like, man, this comparative stuff is really good. As an aside, I get annoyed, really irritated, a little bit angry, but I don't show it. When I go to a talk and someone starts the talk by saying, species X is really unique, because that turns me off immediately. The reason they're a species is because they're unique. So you're not telling me anything I don't know. Every species is unique. So don't start a talk by saying species X is unique. They're also not unique because they share a lot of genes with a bunch of other species. Just tell me what you found. So my long-winded answer to your question is it's definitely not a negative. It's no way it's a negative. And you can always use Darwin to fall back on and say, look what he did. Look how diverse he was. I mean, heck, he came to his ideas by corresponding with pigeon breeders, thoroughbred horse breeders, pigeon breeders. He raised snails. It's like, oh man, you got to be kidding me. Earthworms were one of his favorite species. He used to track earthworms. It's like, my God, this guy's watching earthworms? It's like, you got to be kidding. He spends his time watching. He did experiments with earthworms. You should read his last book too. It's on the vegetable mold earthworms. The last one he wrote in 1882. It's like he's almost dying and he's writing this book. He's finished publishing this book about how great earthworms were. So, stick with it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's really meaningful to hear from you. Thank you very much. I'll end off very quickly just by saying I've read a little bit of Darwin. My favorite Darwin story in talking about the diversity of his interests. He actually was one of my inspirations for pursuing entomology early on in my career. My favorite story was he was on an island and he kept finding beetle species he'd never seen before. And he grabbed one in one hand and started running back to the boat to make notes about it. Then he grabbed one in another hand that he hadn't seen before and was running back to get his field notebook to describe it. And then he found a third one that looked completely different to anything he'd ever seen. And apparently without hesitation, he just took one of the beetle species and popped it in his mouth so he could carry the third.
Yep,
so
exactly. And it stunk. That was when he was a student at Cambridge.
Yes, but yeah, there you go.
He was a student at Cambridge when he did and he concluded that the beetle that he swallowed was stinky, smelly, and terrible.
An important observation.
But he was totally dedicated, and that's it. I mean, my advice to students is actually the opposite, in the sense that if you are not self-motivated and have a total passion, then you don't belong in this field. So instead of saying what you should, I know it sounds terrible, but don't go into the field unless you really and truly don't mind getting wet, dirty, grungy. You don't have to eat stinky beetles to be in the field, but you do have to go through a lot of experiences that some would find terrible. And if you don't mind them, it's like, yeah, then you're cut out. But if you don't like doing that, then you don't belong in the field.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Good luck.
So there is a question for clarification from YouTube audience. And this gets back to the issue of classification of species. And so the question is, if you know that reclassifying a species, giving it a new name, is going to get it delisted from things like the red list, why would anyone want to rename species in the first place?
So my answer is, I have no clue. I don't know. But I think the answer is because a lot of people do not understand how the classification has an impact on the political and legislative issues, which is sort of what Andrew was bringing up. This isn't a question nowadays of a scientific effort. So taxonomy was and used to be a biological means of classifying organisms. It's changed over the years, and now people are using taxonomy in the pursuit of conservation goals without understanding that the conservation goals can't be achieved without following the political and the legislative routines. They don't exist in a vacuum. And so I don't know for sure the answer, Susuma, but I would say just a hunch is a lack of understanding that if you do succeed in convincing people that it's a new species, then you open a Pandora's box to no protection of that new species because it's no longer considered an endangered species, either by the IUCN or CITES, or for that matter, the US Endangered Species Act, because it doesn't exist. It's not listed. And you can't protect a not listed species because it has a new name. So it's just a hunch that is just a lack of understanding of how the system operates.
Well, I mean, I think there are cases where new classification is justified from evolutionary perspectives. But yeah, I see what you're saying about unintended consequences with respect to conservation. And I guess it also raises the question as to whether species are necessarily the best unit for conservation, because you might want to target specific subspecies or, you know, but oh, okay. So here's another question.
Yeah, but exactly. No, I agree. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that could be said about how it works, but this is just the way it works now. That's the system.
Right.
I'm not saying things are, stuck in a rut and you shouldn't rename stuff, but just be aware of what happens.
Okay. There is a long comment / question from Kenneth. Kenneth, would you mind speaking up? If you can use your audio. Oh, you can't use your microphone. Okay, well then I can try to summarize what Kenneth is asking. And Fred, you can read Kenneth's comment on the chat board if you open it up.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can figure this out. Show chat previews. What's it show when I push that button? Oh, okay. Let's see. Have to look. Okay.
At the bottom.
Oh, here's Kenneth. Okay.
Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, so my answer to Kenneth is it's a possibility, but the way that they work is very much ingrained in hard to change. How can I say it? It's very traditional. So to actually shift something to a different status is different. It turns out, so that one of the questions we're having a precautionary default status. It turns out that there is a precautionary principle in CITES, not at IUCN. And the precautionary principle in CITES is if the information essentially shows that the species might be in trouble, then we should list it. Don't wait until it's too late. But there's a lot of governments and folks that ignore the precautionary principle, even though it's like 30, 40 years old. And so the precautionary status is part of CITES, which is ignored and doesn't have any role in IUCN. So there are multiple ways that people can think of to actually change the way the system would work, but they're not in place. And you have to remember, or not you have to, but one thing to keep in mind is hardly any of the people who are in charge, at least of the IUCN, are biologists. They are politicians, they are governments. IUCN's a little different. CITES is government to government rules and regulations. IUCN is more or less an organization of folks, and a lot of those, most of them actually do have a biological background. So there's two different kind of mechanisms there. But I don't think, and I don't know of a tentative way to do anything with either group when you change, when your taxonomic nomenclature for a specific organism is accepted as a change.
Mm.
So yeah, Kenneth, it's great you're tuning in here, even though it's only with the chat. But I agree, it is a shame. There's lots of problems, but one of the other problems, and I'm kind of long-winded, but there's two issues with taxonomy and that relate to conservation is, on the one hand, there are people that talk about taxonomic inertia, which is they aren't changing anything. They're so old-fashioned, they're stuck in the mud. You won't reclassify animals even with new information. Then there's the other side that's called taxonomic inflation. And those are the folks that want to simply split. And by splitting, you end up having more species to save. And so those are the two extremes, but they both, to me, share a common foundation in not using taxonomy as a biological field anymore for classifying relationships. It's become more of an entity and a mechanism to achieve a goal of conservation. And so even the field itself is changing in terms of, is it designed for conservation, or is it designed to establish relationships among animals? I'm not going to answer. I'm just saying this is where the taxonomic part gets more confusing than just the conservation and taxonomy.
Okay. Well, if there's one more quick question, maybe we can take it.
Going once, going twice. Any more questions?
I'll just leave with a comment. Again, thanks so much, Fred. This is really nice to have you join us, and the story and where you presented it. As always, you were laser sharp and brought up a lot of things that people don't think about or think differently about. And I think that's a good message for the students here to see someone who's really followed their passions and contributed so much and has a lot to say for it. Thanks a lot.
No, well, thanks, Mike. It was great talking. And I just say it's, I mean, I think it's been great to actually be able to live kind of like Tarzan. And tell you the truth. And I would say if there's anybody who's listening, they can contact you guys and you can contact me if they do think of questions like at 2 in the morning or something and, you know, want some more information or references or questions, that's fine. Get in touch with you, you'll forward it to me, and then I can go ahead and respond to them.
Okay, thank you again, Fred.
My final message to students is just basically follow your dreams. Don't look for the money. Follow your dreams. The heck with the money. I mean, it's important, but
dreams are very important. Yeah.
Yep.
They're the currency of life.
Agree.
Okay, so I think this is probably a good place to stop the live streaming to YouTube. Please give a round of applause to Dr. Fred Bercovitch.